The scale of the mechanical slaughter is difficult to process, even for the hardened veterans of the 36th Separate Marine Brigade who witnessed it firsthand. On a frozen January morning near the Donetsk settlement of Vodyane, what the Russian command had envisioned as a decisive, war-winning push instead transformed into a catastrophic killing field. At least a dozen armored vehicles, a column of infantry fighting vehicles, main battle tanks, and a specialized MTU, 7-2 armored bridgelayer rolled out from the occupied ruins of Pisky, their engines snarling against the bitter cold, their crews likely expecting a breakthrough. They were met not by a retreating enemy, but by a meticulously integrated web of death. Within hours, the steppe was littered with the burning hulks of Russian steel. Ukrainian defenders neutralized the critical bridge layer, 3 BMP, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, and at least 3 other armored units in the initial wave of destruction. Separate battle damage assessments later revealed that 7 BMP, 1S had been crippled in a single engagement area, bringing the potential total of Russia's armored disaster that day to a staggering 16 vehicles lost. This was not a battle, it was an armor massacre, a brutal testament to how the nature of this conflict has evolved as it grinds relentlessly into its 5th year. The Vodyane engagement serves as a microcosm of the wider war's brutal reality, a conflict that has morphed from a conventional blitzkrieg attempt into a grueling, high-tech war of attrition where offensive maneuvers are punished with horrifying efficiency. The assault force that day was not a ragtag militia, it was a combined arms formation equipped with some of Russia's most capable hardware, designed to punch through defenses and secure strategic ground. The presence of the MTU 7-2 bridge layer was a clear tactical indicator the Russians anticipated needing to cross trenches or small water obstacles to exploit a breakthrough. But the Ukrainian Marines and the soldiers of the 503rd Separate Battalion had transformed the approaches to Vodyane into a kill zone. The footage that later emerged from the battlefield told a story of joint, synchronized destruction. It was not one single weapon system that turned the tide, but a symphony of firepower. Mortars rained down from above, cratering the ground and stripping the infantry of their protective dismounts. Artillery barrages walked across the column, separating the lead vehicles from the trailing support. Then the precision work began. Ukrainian anti-tank guided missile teams, operating with the kind of cold patience that comes from years of war, acquired their targets. At least one tank was obliterated by a Stugna-P missile, a domestic system that has become the bane of Russian armor, its operator likely guiding the projectile onto the vehicle's vulnerable turret ring or reactive armor tiles from a safe distance. Meanwhile, the sky buzzed with a new agent of destruction: drones. Small, commercial-style, unmanned aerial vehicles, rigged with explosives, loitered over the column, waiting for the precise moment to dive onto the thinner top armor of the BMPs, a vulnerability that modern tank designers never fully solved until this war made it fatal. This specific defeat near Vodyane is not an isolated incident, but rather a recurring theme in the current phase of the conflict. As Russian forces have pressed their offensives along the Eastern Front, particularly in the Bakhmut and Avdiivka directions, they have done so at a catastrophic cost in both manpower and machinery. The war has entered a phase where territorial gains, often measured in meters per week, are paid for with the loss of multi-million-dollar equipment and the lives of dozens of soldiers. The Russian military command, despite these losses, continues to feed units into the grinder, attempting to exploit perceived weaknesses in Ukrainian lines. Yet, as the Vodyane assault demonstrates, the Ukrainian defensive lines are not brittle. They are elastic and layered, equipped with the eyes in the sky and the precision ground fire necessary to turn an armored advance into a junkyard. The global implications of this single, brutal engagement extend far beyond the Donetsk Oblast. It is a stark visualization of the strategic deadlock that has defined the 4th year of the war. While Russian President Vladimir Putin has not achieved his original goals of capturing Kyiv and decapitating the Ukrainian government, Moscow has shifted its focus to a war of exhaustion, believing it can outlast Western support and grind down Ukrainian forces through sheer weight of numbers. The Vodyane battle, however, shows the flaw in that calculus. The weight of numbers is being incinerated by Ukrainian technology and tactics faster than Russia can sustainably produce it. 4 years after the full-scale invasion began, the stated Russian goals of demilitarization and denazification ring hollow against the backdrop of burning T-90 tanks. What is being demilitarized is Russia's own modern arsenal, forcing a dangerous reliance on the reactivation of Soviet-era stockpiles. The political landscape surrounding the conflict has shifted dramatically as this war of attrition has dragged on. The fourth anniversary of the invasion, marked on the 24th of February 2026, saw European leaders descend on Kyiv in a powerful show of solidarity, a direct counter-narrative to any suggestion that Ukraine's allies are wavering. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer used the occasion to declare that allies must defeat the falsehood that Russia is winning, a sentiment echoed by French President Emmanuel Macron, who characterized Moscow's adventure as a triple failure for Russia, presumably a failure on the battlefield, a failure in its strategic objectives, and a failure in its diplomatic isolation. This unified front, however, masks the immense pressure building beneath the surface. The G7, despite technically including a United States administration under Donald Trump that has been skeptical of continued aid, issued a joint statement reaffirming unwavering support for Ukraine, a testament to the diplomatic tightrope being walked to maintain the coalition. Yet, the diplomatic reality is fracturing. While leaders stand together in Kyiv, peace negotiations mediated by the United States have repeatedly failed to produce a breakthrough. The rhetoric from the Kremlin remains as maximalist as it was in the war's opening days. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, reiterated on the anniversary that the goals of the operation have not yet been fully achieved, a euphemism that, when decoded, suggests Moscow still harbors ambitions to control Ukrainian sovereignty and territory far beyond the current front lines. Russian state media has even revived the chilling narrative that denazification is inevitably also de-Ukrainization, a phrase that implies the erasure of Ukrainian identity as a legitimate war aim. These are not the words of a party ready to compromise. They are the demands of an aggressor betting on total victory or, at the very least, a frozen conflict that leaves Ukraine permanently crippled. The human cost of this intransigence is being etched into the demography of both nations. As the war enters its fifth year, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky disclosed that at least 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since February 2022, a sobering admission of sacrifice. But the toll on the invading force is exponentially higher. Independent analysis and Western intelligence estimates suggest that Russian military deaths are likely between 243,000 and 352,000, with total casualties, killed and wounded, approaching a catastrophic 1.2 million. The combined military casualties for both sides are now estimated to be nearing 2 million, a figure that evokes the bloody stalemates of the First World War rather than the lightning maneuvers of the 21st century. These numbers are not just statistics, they represent the destruction of an entire generation of young men in Russia, with disproportionate impact on ethnic minorities and impoverished regions who have supplied the bulk of the volunteer contract soldiers, lured by the promise of high salaries. In Kyiv, the mood is a somber mixture of defiance and exhaustion. On the freezing streets of the capital, residents reflect on 4 years of a life defined by air raid sirens, power outages, and the constant thrum of anxiety. Svetlana Yur, a local resident, recalled the morning of the invasion, remembering how she hoped until the very end that war would not come, only to wake to explosions she mistook for bursting tires. For 63-year-old teacher Viktor Buinovsky, the duration of the war hinges on one man in the Kremlin. Everything depends on one person, the president of Russia, he said. He started this war and he must end it. But Putin shows no signs of ending it, despite the immense pressure building on the Russian home front. Instead, Moscow has doubled down, accusing the West of nuclear escalation and plotting to arm Ukraine with weapons of mass destruction, unsubstantiated claims that serve to justify its own aggressive posture and rally the domestic population around the flag. The international reaction to the grinding conflict has become a barometer of a changing world order. The United Nations General Assembly once again passed a resolution calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and lasting peace in Ukraine, a symbolic gesture that passed with 107 votes in favor, but with 12 against and 51 abstentions, a clear indication that the initial global consensus against Russia has eroded. The war is no longer viewed in black and white by the global majority, as nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America balance their historical non-alignment with the economic pressures of a conflicted world. The European Union, however, continues to try and lead the charge. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, announced on her 10th visit to Kyiv since the war began that the EU would deliver a massive €90 billion loan to cover Ukraine's urgent defense needs, a financial lifeline designed to keep the Ukrainian state afloat as it fights for its existence. But even within Europe, the united front is cracking. Hungary wielded its veto power to block the €90 billion loan package, highlighting the growing difficulty of maintaining unanimous support for Ukraine as domestic political pressures mount across the continent. The economic strain of the war is global. The World Bank now estimates the cost of rebuilding Ukraine at a staggering $588 billion over the next decade, a figure that has risen by 12% in just 1 year as the destruction of infrastructure, housing, and industry continues unabated. This is not just a Ukrainian problem, it is a global economic overhang, a debt that will require international financing and decades of labor to clear. The war has fundamentally altered supply chains, forcing a global shift toward friendshoring, moving production to geopolitically aligned nations, which is raising costs and reconfiguring trade patterns away from the efficiency-driven models of the past 3 decades. As the Vodyane armored massacre fades into the daily churn of war news, it leaves behind a critical lesson for military analysts worldwide. The battlefield has undergone a revolution, one that is being watched intently by armies from Washington to Beijing. For a period after the 2022 invasion, it felt like a 20th century battlefield, with massed artillery and linear frontages. Now, drones have fundamentally transformed the way war is fought. The roads leading to the front lines in Donetsk are now surreal tunnels, shrouded in netting suspended from wooden poles 20 feet high, shimmering in the headlights like ghostly tapestries. These nets, often donated by European fishermen, are a crude but effective physical barrier designed to snag the propellers of attacking FPV drones. The Scottish government recently announced it was sending another 280 tons of salmon nets to Ukraine, a bizarre but necessary line item in a modern war. Before the nets are deployed, Ukrainian military units crash drones into them to test their tensile strength, a process that is part science, part desperation. This is the reality of warfare in 2026, a high-tech arms race fought with low-tech adaptations. The drone has become the primary killer on the battlefield, accounting for the vast majority of casualties. It has rendered the massed armored assault like the one attempted at Vodyane almost suicidal unless conducted under an impenetrable umbrella of electronic warfare. But electronic warfare is a fickle shield. The jammer that blocks the enemy drone today can be countered by a new frequency, hopping drone tomorrow. This technological evolution has profound implications for the future of conflict. It suggests that the era of the main battle tank as the undisputed king of the battlefield may be ending. A tank, which can cost upwards of $5 million, can now be destroyed by a drone costing a few $100s, rigged with a shaped charge, and guided by a pilot sitting in a bunker kilometers away. This is the arithmetic of attrition that Russia is struggling with. To continue its slow, grinding advance, it must accept that its armor will be attrited at an unsustainable rate. The Russian military has adapted by increasingly equipping its tanks with crude cope cages, welded metal roofs designed to detonate drones before they hit the turret, but these are far from a perfect solution. They add weight, obstruct vision, and often fail against modern tandem charge warheads. The Russian economy, meanwhile, has been fundamentally remade to sustain this war effort, but the transformation has come at an immense long-term cost. Nearly 40% of Russia's federal budget is now dedicated to the military and security apparatus, with an additional 9% going to service the debt incurred to finance the war. This is a historic diversion of resources away from social development, infrastructure, and future technologies. While the United States and China invest billions in artificial intelligence and green energy, Russia's innovation sector is focused on a singular, grim goal: how to build more shells, more drones, and more tanks and how to circumvent the ever-tightening web of international sanctions. Lots of innovations, what we see now in Russian IT, are devoted to how to circumvent sanctions, noted Alexandra Prokopenko, a former Russian central bank official. Instead of thinking about something new, they spend time and resources on how to replace what has already been done but is not available now. The Kremlin is burning through its fiscal reserves at an alarming rate. The National Wealth Fund, a rainy day cushion that Putin carefully built up using oil and gas revenues, has seen its liquid reserves plummet from $113 billion before the war to approximately $55 billion today. This is the financial equivalent of the armor burning at Vodyane, a stockpile of national treasure being consumed in a conflict that shows no signs of ending. Russia's energy revenues, the lifeblood of its economy, dropped by almost a quarter last year as global prices softened and sanctions forced Russian crude to be sold at a permanent discount. To get its oil to market, Moscow has spent over $10 billion assembling a shadow fleet of aging, often uninsured tankers that operate outside the Western-dominated shipping industry, a risky and expensive workaround that bleeds revenue with every voyage. The social consequences inside Russia are paradoxical. On the surface, Moscow appears surprisingly normal. Restaurants are bustling, the metro is packed, and the Bolshoi Theater is performing to full houses. This veneer of normalcy is a deliberate policy choice by the Kremlin, which has prioritized stability and consumer spending over long-term economic growth. By fighting inflation and maintaining social payouts, the government has insulated the urban middle class from the direct costs of the war, but beneath the surface, the strain is evident. In the impoverished regions of Buryatia and Dagestan, the war has created a strange economic boomlet as young men sign lucrative contracts with the defense ministry, sending home salaries and bonuses that fuel local housing markets. This creates a perverse incentive structure where the poorest segments of society are economically motivated to provide the cannon fodder for the imperial project. Russian society is also experiencing a profound demographic shock. The war is exacerbating a pre-existing population crisis. With as many as 325,000 troops dead and hundreds of thousands more having fled the country to avoid mobilization or conscription, Russia's human capital is draining away. Some studies predict the Russian population could, in pessimistic scenarios, drop below 100 million by the end of the century, down from roughly 145 million before the war. This is a demographic catastrophe that will have implications for the Russian economy and military power for generations. The young people who remain are increasingly disconnected from the war's patriotic fervor. A recent survey found that 59% of Russians aged 18 to 29 would support a withdrawal from Ukraine without achieving Putin's stated goals, compared to only 42% of the general population. The youth, it seems, are less willing to sacrifice their futures for a war they see as distant and abstract. As the conflict grinds on, the diplomatic efforts to end it have become a confusing dance of signals and countersignals. The United States, under President Trump, has launched a peace initiative that envisions a trilateral negotiation process involving the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine. After rounds of talks in Abu Dhabi and Geneva, officials on the American side have suggested that the gap between the two warring parties is narrowing to a few difficult issues, primarily revolving around the territorial status of the Donbas region. However, Ukrainian President Zelensky has been far less optimistic, publicly stating through his official channels that there remains a lot of daylight between the negotiating positions. The Kremlin continues to demand that Ukrainian forces withdraw from the remaining 10% of Donbas not currently under Russian control, a non-starter for Kyiv, which views any territorial concession as a betrayal of its constitution and the memory of its fallen soldiers. The fourth round of these high-stakes negotiations is reportedly scheduled for late February 2026, possibly in Geneva, but hopes for a breakthrough remain minimal. The fundamental incompatibility of the two sides' objectives is the immovable object blocking any peace deal. Russia seeks Ukraine's capitulation, or at least a neutrality agreement that would permanently bar it from NATO and effectively leave it defenseless in Russia's sphere of influence. Ukraine seeks security guarantees, so ironclad that Russia will never dare to invade again, preferably through NATO membership or a bilateral defense pact with the United States and the United Kingdom. These two positions are mutually exclusive. The failed armored assault at Vodyane, therefore, is not just a military defeat, it is a diplomatic data point. It tells the Kremlin that its military, despite being larger than Ukraine's, cannot impose its will on the battlefield cheaply or quickly. Every burning BMP is an argument for negotiation. Yet, paradoxically, the Russian leadership may interpret such losses not as a reason to stop, but as a reason to push harder, to mobilize more resources, and to break the Ukrainian army through sheer exhaustion. This is the terrifying logic of a war of attrition. Once you have invested 1 million casualties and $1 trillion, accepting a compromise can feel like admitting that the sacrifice was for nothing. The calculus of attrition extends far beyond the immediate tactical considerations of the Donetsk front, reaching into the very heart of Russian strategic doctrine. For decades, the General Staff in Moscow planned for large-scale conventional operations against NATO, believing that massed artillery and armored thrusts could overwhelm European defenses before the alliance could effectively respond. The Vodyane massacre and thousands of similar engagements have fundamentally challenged this assumption. The Russian military is learning, at immense cost, that the battlefield of the 2020s is a transparent, lethal environment where mass without sophisticated electronic warfare and air defense coverage is simply mass slaughter. The implications for global security are profound. If Russia, with its vast Soviet-era stockpiles, cannot conduct a successful mechanized assault against a determined defender armed with modern anti-tank weapons and ubiquitous drone surveillance, then the entire concept of armored warfare as practiced for the last 80 years must be re-evaluated by militaries worldwide. This re-evaluation is already underway in Pentagon war rooms and NATO exercise grounds. The United States Army has accelerated its own drone and counter-drone programs, recognizing that the era of the tank as the dominant maneuver force may be drawing to a close. The M1 Abrams, the backbone of American armor, is now being fitted with sophisticated active protection systems designed to intercept incoming missiles and drones, a recognition that passive armor alone is no longer sufficient for survival. European militaries are scrambling to procure loitering munitions and electronic warfare systems, belatedly realizing that the defense budgets they slashed after the Cold War left them dangerously unprepared for the reality of high-intensity conflict. The war in Ukraine has become a live-fire exercise for the future of warfare, and the lessons are being written in the burning wreckage of Russian BMPs. The economic reverberations of this attritional conflict have permanently altered Europe's energy landscape. The days of cheap Russian natural gas flowing through Nord Stream pipelines are over, likely forever. Germany, the industrial engine of Europe, has been forced to undergo a painful restructuring of its energy mix, reopening coal plants while scrambling to build liquefied natural gas terminals to import from Qatar and the United States. The cost of this transition has been borne by European consumers and industries, contributing to inflation and undermining competitiveness. The European Central Bank has struggled to contain price increases, with energy costs remaining volatile and susceptible to global market shocks. Russia, for its part, has lost its most reliable and lucrative customer. While it has successfully redirected some gas flows to China through the Power of Siberia pipeline, the volumes are far smaller, and the prices negotiated with Beijing are significantly lower than what Europe once paid. This is a permanent loss of revenue that will constrain the Russian budget for decades. The social fabric within Ukraine has been stretched to its breaking point, yet it has not snapped. 4 years of war have forged a new national identity, one defined by resistance and sacrifice. The Ukrainian language, once suppressed in favor of Russian in many eastern cities, has experienced a renaissance, becoming a symbol of defiance. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine has formally severed ties with the Moscow Patriarchate, a religious schism that mirrors the political divide and has deep historical resonance. However, the human cost is incalculable. Millions of Ukrainians remain displaced, scattered across Europe as refugees. Families have been torn apart, with millions of children growing up knowing their fathers primarily through video calls from the front lines. The psychological trauma inflicted by 4 years of shelling, occupation, and loss will take generations to heal. The Ukrainian educational system has been forced to adapt, with many children attending classes online from bomb shelters, a lost generation in terms of social development and traditional learning. International humanitarian organizations have documented widespread devastation to Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. The World Health Organization has verified over 1,400 attacks on healthcare facilities since the invasion began, a systematic targeting that violates the Geneva Conventions and has crippled the country's ability to care for its wounded and sick. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in June 2023, an act widely attributed to Russian forces, caused an ecological and humanitarian catastrophe, flooding dozens of villages, destroying farmland, and disrupting water supplies to Crimea. The environmental damage from the war is staggering, with millions of acres of agricultural land contaminated by unexploded ordnance and heavy metals from munitions. The United Nations Environment Program estimates that demining Ukraine will take decades and cost tens of billions of dollars, a hidden tax on the country's future prosperity. The political implications within Russia are equally profound, though more opaque. Vladimir Putin has consolidated power to an extent unmatched in modern Russian history, crushing or exiling all meaningful opposition. The death of Alexei Navalny in an Arctic penal colony in early 2024 removed the last figure capable of mobilizing significant domestic protest. The Russian political system has become a monolith, with the security services, the military, and the oligarchic class all bound to Putin's survival. However, beneath the surface of this stability, tensions are simmering. The Wagner Group mutiny of June 2023, led by the late Yevgeny Prigozhin, exposed deep fissures between the regular military establishment and the irregular forces that have borne much of the war's burden. While the mutiny was crushed and Prigozhin subsequently killed in a mysterious plane crash, the underlying grievances about competence, corruption, and the wasteful expenditure of soldiers' lives remain unresolved. The Russian military command structure has been purged multiple times since the invasion began, with generals dismissed, arrested, or reassigned following battlefield failures. The current commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, General Valery Gerasimov, has survived despite overseeing some of the costliest campaigns of the war, but his position is perpetually precarious. The Ministry of Defense, under the leadership of Andrei Belousov, a civilian economist appointed to clean house after the Prigozhin mutiny, has focused on improving logistics, rooting out corruption in military procurement, and integrating the volunteer units into the regular command structure. These reforms are designed to create a more sustainable war effort, recognizing that the conflict is now a marathon, not a sprint. The appointment of a technocrat to run the defense establishment signals that the Kremlin is planning for a long war, one that will require efficient management of resources rather than impulsive gambles. The European response to the fourth anniversary of the war has been marked by a determined effort to future-proof support for Ukraine against the possibility of a less friendly administration in Washington. European leaders have accelerated discussions about creating a European defense fund, separate from NATO, that could provide Ukraine with long-term military assistance regardless of the outcome of American elections. The European Commission has proposed using the windfall profits from frozen Russian sovereign assets, estimated at billions of euros, to finance arms purchases for Ukraine. This proposal, while legally complex and certain to face Russian legal challenges, represents a significant escalation in the financial war. Seizing sovereign assets, even just the profits generated by them, crosses a threshold that the West has long been hesitant to approach. It sets a precedent that could have implications for the global financial system, potentially making other nations wary of holding their reserves in Western currencies. The Asian response to the ongoing conflict remains a critical factor in the global balance. China has positioned itself as a potential peace broker, releasing a 12-point peace plan early in the war, but has simultaneously provided Russia with a crucial economic lifeline. Chinese purchases of Russian oil and gas have helped offset the loss of European markets, and Chinese exports of dual-use technologies, including microelectronics and drone components, have been essential to Russia's war effort. Beijing walks a careful diplomatic tightrope, calling for territorial integrity and sovereignty in principle while refusing to condemn Russian aggression in practice. This posture serves Chinese interests by weakening its strategic rival, the United States, through a prolonged, draining conflict, while positioning China as a responsible global power capable of mediating disputes. The deepening strategic partnership between Russia and China, formalized in numerous joint statements and military exercises, is one of the most significant geopolitical consequences of the war, creating a counterweight to Western dominance that will outlast the fighting in Ukraine. India has maintained its historical balancing act, increasing purchases of discounted Russian oil while deepening defense and intelligence cooperation with the United States, Japan, and Australia through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has repeatedly spoken with both Putin and Zelensky, urging a return to dialogue, but has refrained from condemning Russian aggression. This posture reflects India's strategic autonomy and its dependence on Russia for military spare parts and diplomatic support in its own neighborhood. The Global South, broadly defined, has refused to fall in line behind Western sanctions and narratives, viewing the conflict through the lens of their own historical experiences with colonialism and great power intervention. This fragmentation of the international order is perhaps the war's most enduring legacy, accelerating the transition from a unipolar American-dominated system to a multipolar world where regional powers increasingly chart their own course. The military situation on the ground as the war enters its fifth year defies easy characterization. The front lines have moved little in the past 12 months, with Russian forces making incremental gains in the Donbass, while Ukrainian forces struggle to hold defensive lines in the face of relentless Russian assaults. The capture of Avdiivka in early 2024, after months of brutal fighting, was hailed as a significant victory by Russian state media, but the cost was staggering. Russian losses in the battle for the small town, which had been transformed into a fortress, were estimated at tens of thousands of casualties and hundreds of armored vehicles. The strategic value of Avdiivka, like the value of Bakhmut before it, was primarily symbolic. Its capture demonstrated that Russia could still take territory, but only at a cost that would be unsustainable against a properly defended NATO member. The Ukrainian strategy has shifted to a defensive posture, conserving manpower while attriting Russian forces through deep strikes and tactical defenses. Ukrainian intelligence and special operations forces have proven adept at striking deep behind Russian lines, targeting ammunition depots, command posts, and logistics hubs with a combination of domestic drones and Western-supplied missiles. The sinking of the Russian missile cruiser Moskva in the early days of the war, the devastating strikes on the Sevastopol naval base, and the systematic degradation of the Russian Black Sea Fleet have demonstrated Ukraine's ability to project power far from the front lines. These strikes have forced the Russian Navy to relocate much of its fleet from Crimea to Novorossiysk, easing the pressure on Ukrainian maritime exports and reopening a vital economic artery. The ability to export grain through the Black Sea, despite Russia's withdrawal from the UN-brokered grain deal, has been a significant economic victory for Ukraine, stabilizing its currency and providing much-needed revenue. The air war remains a critical and underappreciated dimension of the conflict. Russia continues to launch massive missile and drone barrages against Ukrainian energy infrastructure, attempting to freeze the population into submission. These campaigns have been partially successful, causing widespread blackouts and forcing Ukrainians to endure another winter in the cold and dark. However, the Ukrainian air defense network, progressively strengthened by Western systems like Patriot, IRIS-T, and NASAMS, has become increasingly effective at intercepting Russian missiles and drones. The provision of F-16 fighter jets, finally arriving in Ukrainian skies after years of pilot training and diplomatic negotiation, has begun to challenge Russian air superiority, at least in localized sectors. The introduction of Western tactical aviation, combined with Ukraine's innovative use of drones, is gradually pushing Russian aircraft and helicopters further from the front lines, reducing their ability to provide close air support to ground troops. The Western alliance's commitment to Ukraine's long-term security was formalized in a series of bilateral security agreements signed throughout 2024 and 2025. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and dozens of other nations have committed to providing Ukraine with sustained military assistance, intelligence sharing, and training for a decade or more. These agreements are designed to deter future Russian aggression by making clear that Ukraine's defense is not a temporary project, but a permanent commitment of the Western alliance. They stop short of the mutual defense guarantee enshrined in NATO Article 5, but they represent the closest alternative, a web of bilateral promises that collectively create a formidable deterrent. For Ukraine, these agreements provide the predictability necessary to plan long-term military modernization, shifting from a wartime ad hoc force to a professional, NATO-standard military capable of defending its borders independently. The Russian response to these security guarantees has been predictably hostile. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has characterized them as proof that the West is preparing for a direct war with Russia, a narrative designed to mobilize domestic support and justify further military expansion. The Kremlin has responded by revising its nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. The new doctrine, signed by Putin in late 2024, states that Russia may consider nuclear response to aggression against itself or its allies, including aggression involving conventional weapons that threatens the sovereignty or territorial integrity of Russia or Belarus. It also expands the definition of the conditions under which nuclear weapons might be used to include reliable information about a massive launch of air and space attack means, such as strategic and tactical aircraft, cruise missiles, drones, and hypersonic weapons. This doctrinal shift is clearly aimed at deterring the West from providing Ukraine with long-range strike capabilities that could threaten Russian territory. The nuclear rhetoric from Moscow has intensified as the conventional situation on the ground has stagnated. Russian officials and state television pundits regularly threaten Western capitals with annihilation, a campaign of intimidation designed to sow fear and division among Ukraine's allies. While Western intelligence agencies assess that the probability of Russian nuclear use remains low, the risk cannot be dismissed entirely. The war has already shattered numerous post-World War II taboos, from the targeting of civilian infrastructure to the use of mercenary forces as a tool of state policy. The possibility that a desperate Kremlin, facing a catastrophic conventional defeat or a regime-threatening internal revolt, might resort to battlefield nuclear weapons is a nightmare scenario that Western planners are forced to take seriously. This has created a paradoxical situation where the West must support Ukraine sufficiently to prevent its defeat, but not so aggressively that it provokes a nuclear escalation, a delicate balancing act that limits the types and ranges of weapons provided. The role of Belarus in the conflict has evolved significantly since the early days of the invasion, when its territory was used as a staging ground for the failed assault on Kyiv. Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian leader, has skillfully navigated between his dependence on Moscow and his desire to preserve his own sovereignty and avoid direct military involvement. Belarus has hosted Russian tactical nuclear weapons, participated in joint military exercises, and allowed its territory to be used for missile launches, but it has so far avoided committing its own troops to the fight. This has preserved the Belarusian army as a credible fighting force, while simultaneously tying Belarus ever closer to Russia. The prospect of Belarusian entry into the war remains a latent threat, a force that Ukraine must guard against by maintaining substantial forces along its northern border, forces that could otherwise be deployed to the Eastern Front. The economic sanctions regime against Russia has evolved into a complex, multi-layered system of restrictions that covers everything from high-tech exports to diamonds and vodka. The initial sanctions, imposed in 2022, were designed to collapse the Russian economy quickly. When that failed, the West shifted to a strategy of attrition, gradually tightening the screws to degrade Russia's industrial capacity over time. The impact has been cumulative and significant. Russian defense industries, while operating at full capacity, are hampered by shortages of precision components. Microchips from washing machines and refrigerators have been found in Russian missiles, a testament to the ingenuity of Russian procurement officers, but also to the constraints they face. The Russian financial system, while stabilized by capital controls and the forced conversion of foreign currency earnings, remains cut off from the global banking network. The dominance of the US dollar in international transactions means that Russia must conduct trade through complex, inefficient barter arrangements or through the limited channels of its own financial infrastructure. The oil price cap, imposed by the G7 and the European Union, has been a key tool in this economic war. By prohibiting Western insurance and shipping services from handling Russian crude sold above $60 per barrel, the cap was designed to keep Russian oil flowing to global markets to prevent price spikes while simultaneously reducing the revenue Moscow earns from each barrel. The scheme has had mixed results. Russia has successfully assembled its shadow fleet of tankers to evade the cap, but the costs of this fleet, combined with the discounts Russia must offer its buyers, have reduced its oil revenue significantly. The recent drop in global oil prices has compounded the effect, squeezing the Russian budget from both sides. The International Energy Agency estimates that Russian oil and gas revenues have fallen by roughly 30% since the invasion, a permanent loss that constrains the Kremlin's ability to finance its war machine and maintain domestic stability. The internal Russian debate about the war, to the extent that such a debate can exist in an authoritarian system, centers on the question of mobilization. The partial mobilization announced in September 2022 triggered a mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of military-age men and sparked protests in ethnic minority regions that bore the brunt of the draft. Putin has been reluctant to order a second wave of mobilization, fearing the political and social consequences. Instead, the military has relied on a combination of volunteer contract soldiers, incentivized by ever higher signing bonuses, and the covert mobilization of convicts through private military companies like Wagner before its leadership was eliminated and its successor organizations. This approach has provided a steady stream of manpower, but has failed to generate the massive numbers needed for a decisive breakthrough. The Russian army in Ukraine is large, but it is not large enough to conduct multiple simultaneous offensive operations along the entire front, forcing it to concentrate forces in specific sectors while remaining defensive elsewhere. The Ukrainian manpower situation is equally challenging. After 4 years of war, the pool of available volunteers has been exhausted, forcing the government to implement increasingly stringent mobilization laws. Men of fighting age are prohibited from leaving the country, and draft officers regularly conduct raids on gyms, restaurants, and public events to identify and process potential conscripts. This has created social tensions, with some Ukrainians viewing the draft as unfair or corrupt, allowing the wealthy or well-connected to avoid service, while the poor are sent to the front. President Zelensky has acknowledged these concerns, dismissing regional draft chiefs and promising reforms, but the fundamental challenge remains. BN Zelensky has acknowledged ATN's ATEP. Ukraine has a smaller population than Russia and has already suffered tens of thousands of killed and hundreds of thousands wounded. Replacing these losses is a demographic and political challenge that will only grow more acute as the war drags on. The international legal dimensions of the conflict continue to unfold, albeit slowly. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, for the alleged war crime of unlawfully deporting Ukrainian children to Russia. The warrants have turned Putin into a pariah in much of the world, restricting his ability to travel to ICC member states and symbolically tarnishing his legacy. However, the court has no enforcement mechanism and relies on member states to execute arrests, a near impossibility given Putin's tight security and the unwillingness of Russia's allies to comply. The International Court of Justice has ordered Russia to suspend its invasion, a ruling Russia has ignored. The creation of a special tribunal to try the crime of aggression against Ukraine remains under discussion among Western allies, but establishing such a tribunal with broad international legitimacy faces significant legal and political hurdles. The pursuit of justice, while important for the victims and for establishing historical record, is a long-term project that will likely take decades to reach any meaningful conclusion. The cultural and information war surrounding the conflict shows no signs of abating. Russian state media, banned in Europe but widely available elsewhere, continues to propagate elaborate conspiracy theories about Ukrainian Nazis, Western biolabs, and American plots to dismember Russia. These narratives, while detached from reality, are effective at mobilizing the domestic Russian audience and finding resonance among anti-Western audiences in the global South. Ukraine has responded with its own information campaigns, highlighting Russian atrocities, celebrating its cultural resilience, and lobbying Western governments for continued support. The battle for global public opinion is a critical front in this war, influencing political decisions in capitals from New Delhi to Brasilia. The Ukrainian strategy has focused on humanizing the conflict, telling the stories of individual victims and soldiers to counter the abstraction of war statistics. The Russian strategy has focused on delegitimizing Ukraine as a state, arguing that it is an artificial creation of the Soviet Union and the West, with no historical right to exist. As the sun sets on another day of fighting in the Donbass, the wreckage of the Russian armored column near Vodyane smolders in the frozen fields. The vehicles, once symbols of Russian military might, are now blackened skeletons, their turrets blown off, their hulls riddled with penetration marks. Ukrainian sappers will eventually clear the area, recovering any usable components and towing the wrecks to scrap yards where the metal will be melted down and repurposed. The crews, those who were not incinerated in the initial explosions, have been added to the grim tally of Russian dead, their families notified through the impersonal machinery of military bureaucracy. The battle was just one of dozens fought that day along the 1,000-kilometer front, a brutal, anonymous engagement that will rate barely a mention in the official histories. Yet, in its brutality and its cost, it encapsulates everything about this war: the technological transformation of warfare, the human sacrifice, the strategic deadlock, and the immense price that both nations are paying for the ambitions of their leaders. The question that hangs over the battlefield, over Kyiv, over Moscow, and over the Western capitals that have poured billions into Ukraine's defense is simple. How does this end? The answer remains as elusive as it was on the first day of the invasion. Neither side possesses the military capacity to deliver a decisive knockout blow. Russia cannot capture and hold the remaining Ukrainian territory necessary to impose its will. Ukraine cannot expel Russian forces from the approximately 18% of its land they currently occupy without a dramatic and unlikely escalation of Western support. The war has become a test of endurance, a brutal competition to see which society will break first under the strain of endless casualties, economic pressure, and political exhaustion. The armored massacre at Vodyane is not an anomaly, it is the new normal. And as the war enters its 5th year, the world watches and waits for some sign that the killing might finally stop, even as the evidence on the ground suggests that the guns will continue to roar for the foreseeable future.